Example 4 says if the sine of theta times the secant of theta is greater than 0, determine the possible quadrants in which the angle lies. So what we want to try to understand here is how different pieces of trigonometry work. So if we look at our different quadrants, we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So to figure out how these things work, again, we need to know what our different forms are. So we've got cosine is, remember, is going to be x over r. And sine of theta is going to be r over x. And we know that tangent of theta is going to be, or excuse me, sine of theta is crazy, is y over r, and tangent of theta is y over x. So when we think about our coordinate points, the other ones are going to be the same sign as the other ones. So it's useful. So this will have same as secant, same as cosecant, and this will be the same as cotangent. So that's useful for us. So let's think about in our first quadrant. In our first quadrant, we have cosine. That is, x is going to be positive. R is always positive, so this is always really nice. So if x is positive, y is positive, then we have these, all these things make positives. Yay! So the first quadrant is quite good that way. So our second quadrant, now we have our cosine is actually, or excuse me, our cosine, our x coordinate is negative. So we get a negative, it makes this whole group negative. Sine's still positive, so we have positive here, and because we have a positive over a negative for our y and x, we have negative for tangent and cotangent. So it's all about thinking about what the values of x and y could be. Now, when we go to our third quadrant, x is negative. That makes secant and cosine negative. Sine, the y is negative, which makes sine and cosecant negative. And both sine and cosine are negative, which actually makes tangent and cotangent positive. So this is kind of a unique thing where because you have a negative divided by a negative, we have a positive number. And then lastly, we've got our fourth quadrant. So x is positive again. That makes our secant and cosine positives. Sine is going to be, or y is going to be negative, which makes our sine and cosecant negative. And tangent, we have our, even though our x is now positive, our sine is negative, so our tangent and cotangent are negatives. So this is a useful thing for us to understand. So let me look at this, and so we can use this pieces of information to help us out. So if we know that sine of theta times secant of theta is greater than 0, so all the possible combinations here. So we need two numbers that multiply to make a positive number. Well, that means that we could have two different scenarios. We could say, hey, well, sine is greater than 0, and secant is greater than 0. Or sine could be less than 0, and secant could be less than 0, because a negative times a negative is positive, and so on and so forth. So, where is our, and let's make a little picture here, where is our sine positive? That would be helpful for us. So our sine is going to be positive when we have positive y values. So this could happen in the first or second. Our secant has to do with cosine. So that's when our cosine is positive. That is over here. Because remember, it's 1 over cosine. So we're going to have the first or the third. So right off the bat, these two have to agree, right? We need to know that each of those has to work. So theta is the same angle. So the only ones that work is going to be the first quadrant. So we know the first quadrant is one answer. Now, sine is going to be negative when we are in the third or fourth quadrant. Secant will be negative when we are in, because remember this is when we cosine, it's negative, so that's our x. That's going to be when we have in the second or third quadrant. So from this, we are shared thirds, so we know that we could have the first or third would work for this. Remember, they all have to do with the x and y. That's really all that matters. So where is our point in this plane? If we understand how that works, we can understand the logic of how this trigonometry is going to exist.